Hello, everyone, and welcome to Brave Minds Healing Anxiety and Trauma, the podcast brought to you by Brave Minds Psychological Services in New Jersey. On this podcast, we explore the journey of healing, resilience, and mental well being. Whether you're navigating anxiety, processing trauma, or supporting somebody who is, you are in the right place. I'm Lisa Weiss. I'm a licensed mental health therapist here at Brave Minds, and each episode will dive into real conversation, expert insights, and practical tools to help you better understand your mind and support your healing process. In today's episode, we are chatting with Alexandria Bleich. She is our therapist at the practice that specializes in working with grief, and today is about diving into the complexities of grief, particularly focusing on the experience of losing a parent. So, before we begin, please remember that this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It's not intended to diagnose, treat, or replace professional mental health care. If you are in crisis or need support, please reach out to a qualified provider. And thank you so much for listening in. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm super excited to learn more about your niche and about just your grief specialty. And it's good to chat because I feel like you and I never see each other because we work in different locations.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, happy to share a little bit more about grief and my passion for working with grief. And yes, I know we're in two separate offices, so we don't have a chance to catch up as frequently.
Yes, absolutely. So we can kind of get started there with just like what drew you to your work in grief and specifically with individuals who have lost parents.
Yeah, so I think grief is really one of the only true universal human experiences, and yet somehow we are just totally underprepared for it. And for me, that was certainly true. I lost my dad at a really young age, and I know firsthand how that loss just totally reshaped my entire world. And at that time, I remember desperately wishing that I could talk to somebody who truly understood, right? Not just like sympathized, but had actually walked that path. And now I have that privilege of being that person for others that are navigating the same journey. And it feels full circle in a really meaningful way.
That is so wonderful and like almost like, and I don't want to speak for you, but like a reparative kind of experience to be able to provide that service for people when maybe that wasn't available for you during that time.
Yeah, absolutely. People might be familiar with like the stages and phases of grief, but really like the last one is really like finding meaning. And I think this has been a way for me to just find meaning from all of my losses, but especially working with those who have lost a parent. Like that just feels so personal to me.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's beautiful though, like the finding meaning in it. And I know later on in this episode I wanted to touch on like the stages model and how that could be oversimplified, but I have a couple questions before we get there. So, yeah, when we talk about grief, people often imagine like the first few months after a loss. So, from your perspective, what does grief really look like across the lifetime?
Right. So I think most people really picture grief as that like immediate aftermath, right? Like the funeral, the first holidays without them, those like brutal, really painful early months. And that's definitely part of it. But grief doesn't have an expiration date, right? I tell my clients, like, how long will that person be missing from your life, the rest of your life, right? So it's this lifelong process. Early on, it might feel like it's taking up all the space, like we're drowning in it. But as time goes on, it shifts. It's still there, but it looks different. Maybe a song comes on and suddenly you're like right back in it, or you hit a milestone and just feel their absence like all over again. I think it's less about getting to some finish line where we're like done grieving and we can like check that off, and more about learning to carry it alongside everything else in our life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and like being able to it's not something we move past. It's like we grow around it in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. I always talk to clients too about how I feel like grief, it can lie dormant for a little while. And then like something like you said, a song comes on or something reminds you and it's right back there again. And I think that can feel very confusing for people, especially if it's been, few days, few weeks, months that they've been feeling a little bit better and that stuff can resurface. All of those feelings flood back.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so normal, but I can see how folks would find that jarring. Like, I've been doing so much better. Why now? Why this?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess as far as like losing a parent during childhood or adolescence, how do you feel like that affects like development or even identity?
Yeah, I think when we lose a parent at like a fundamental age, it just totally disrupts like our sense of safety, our sense of stability. We're at this like developmental stage where we're supposed to be figuring out who we are. And now all of a sudden we're also faced with trying to figure out who we are without like that person in our lives. And I also think, kids learn at a young age that bad things can happen. Bad things can happen to me way too early, which impacts then how they attach to people later in life. In life, some folks maybe get really hyper vigilant about losing other people, right? If we've lost one, we've lost our father, maybe we're like really nervous then. It's like, you know, is mom going to die too? And I think we learn to kind of struggle to trust those relationships that they can be permanent. Or maybe we feel like we have to grow up too fast. Like, for example, a young boy who lost his father might feel like he now needs to step up and be like, the man of the house, so to speak. And then many carry this like underlying belief that just the world is not safe because if your parents can die, like what else could possibly go wrong? So that impact really just like ripples through everything. The peer relationships, our self-worth, how we kind of navigate life's uncertainties all become affected.
Yeah, like a domino effect. And I think that's something that like maybe people don't consider, like just how it doesn't affect you in just like one area, but it can affect like your peer relationships, performance in school, and all those kinds of things. And losing that sense of safety and security. Like it's very hard to be like grounded in the here and now if you're so worried about what's gonna happen to mom, or is she gonna be okay while I'm at school, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I know I had mentioned too, just like the stages model and how oversimplified it is compared to like an actual lived process. So I'm curious to hear from you and like the work that you do. Like, what is that like as far as like following some sort of like, the five stages of grief? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, it's not linear. It's not this like neat little thing where it's like we're in one state, where all of a sudden we're angry and then we're bargaining. And then it's like, it's not this neat thing that we can just like follow. And with that, it means there's no like finish line for it either. And I think that is uncomfortable for a lot of folks, right? I think we like want to just get over grief. Like it's just this thing that we can just be done with at some point. And I think there's a few reasons for that. At first, right, pain is really uncomfortable. So we just want that to stop, right? And that idea that grief could last forever is unbearable. So I think we create these timelines in our head like, okay, I'll feel better 6 months from now, or at that 1 year mark, I'll be okay, as a way to kind of try to contain something that I think just feels really uncontrollable or unmanageable. And then I think we as a society, we as like a culture, just everything's supposed to be fixable and there's a solution for everything. And when we're continually grieving, when we're still grieving months later, years later, uncomfortable. So I think we want to be over it. Other people want us to be over it so they can stop worrying about us or stop being even reminded of like their own mortality. But grief really isn't a problem that needs solving. It's love, right? It's a natural consequence of caring deeply about someone. And that doesn't just like disappear on
Yeah,
the timeline or on a schedule as much as we would want it to.
absolutely. And you said something there that was like, oof, of like people like want us to just be over it, or like, it's been X amount of time. Like, why are you still feeling this way? Or like, do I have to keep taking care of you? So, yeah, I think that's something that is not often talked about of like, am I allowed to continue to feel these things because, of the opinions of other people? That can feel extremely heavy, like feeling like you need to be speeding up some sort of process for the sake of other people's comfort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, as much as, yeah, that would be ideal that we can just like be over it, both for our own personal reasons, for other people. I think that, yeah, we can kind of lean into like that people pleasing. It's like, okay, I'll just like be strong and like I'll put on a brave face. I think it's very realistic, unfortunately.
No, that is absolutely not how that works. So, how do you sit with clients in that, like that kind of feeling where they feel like they do need to be on a timeline from things they've read or things that they've like seen on social media?
Yeah. I always tell my clients, like I said, that unfortunately it's going to be a lifelong process. It's going to hit us and affect us differently. The intensity, like the frequency of the pain is going to be different, maybe a few years out than when we're in that like acute grief, when we're in that like immediate after effect or we're feeling those immediate after effects. So I kind of prepare them that, it's going to be painful for a while and it's okay. And again, that it's just, I'm not here to fix it. I'm just here to sit with you. I'm not trying to solve it. I'm not trying to tell you to not feel that way or like all of your feelings, of course, are valid, right? It's not just the sadness. Sometimes it's like the guilt or the anger that they're not there anymore. So it's just kind of preparing ourselves, preparing, our clients for the magnitude of emotions that we're going to be feeling and like letting them know that it's okay to fall apart if we need to.
Absolutely. And even being able to like provide that education to clients on like this is what you could experience, and also like everybody experiences grief differently, so like not to compare how you're feeling about a particular loss versus like how somebody else is feeling for a similar loss or whatever that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though I have personally experienced losing my dad, how I kind of navigated that or what that was like for me might be different than the clients that, sit across from me in my office. But just normalizing the experience of grief because it really is such a normal process. I think, it's pathologized a lot, but there's nothing wrong with grieving. And for X amount of time. Like you said, it's different really for everyone. There is no right way to grieve. I tell clients like there's only the right way for you. There's a way that like feels the most right for you.
Yeah, and being able to lean into that even if it's not seen as like the norm for whatever like that might be. So I think it's so important to have that space and that support that you provide to your clients. It's I don't know, I really think it is such like a sacred space.
Absolutely.
And you had mentioned too, you mentioned the words acute grief. So can you tell us the difference between like acute grief and integrated grief?
Yeah. Acute grief is like the first even like 2 years really after a loss, right? I think we think of it as that like the immediate effects that we feel of grief, whether it's like kind of getting through the funeral, like I said, or yeah, just like the first couple of months. And know, yes, it's like yes and it's that. And then but integrated grief is kind of like it evolves with us. Grief grows with us. So when we integrate our grief into our story, it becomes part of our story, but it's not all encompassing anymore. Does that make sense?
It does. And like how you continue to move forward with life and like carrying that with you, it sounds like. Okay. So and I know too we were chatting about losing a parent for young children. So what are some ways that grief often reappears as a person grows? So this could be either at big life moments or even in those subtle moments. What do you typically see?
Yeah. Like I said, grief really has a habit of evolving with us and has a way of really resurfacing at like each new chapter. And how we grieved as a 10-year-old will look different than how we're grieving at 25. It's not that we necessarily forgot or got over it. It's that with like each new chapter of life, there's maybe a different or new awareness for what they're missing. So those big milestones might be really obvious grief triggers, right? We're getting married and, I can't do a father-daughter dance, or maybe I'm becoming a parent and I wish that, my mom was there to become a grandma. So those big milestones are really obvious, but it's also in those more subtle moments, like that first time you try to make their recipe, but can't remember like an ingredient or how to make it, or maybe something funny happens and you just want to call them and tell them about it. So I think it's both. It comes up in unexpected ways as we get older.
Absolutely. Makes me think of like even when I lost my grandma, like wanting to be able to call her. And you have that moment of like, oh, just let me give her a call. And then to know, oh wow. So it does hit you. It's interesting how the brain works in that kind of way.
Absolutely.
Okay. So for someone who loses a parent before really knowing them as an adult, what kinds of emotions or longings might surface later on in life?
We don't just grieve and mourn the loss of our parent. Like, I think we also mourn the loss of the relationship that could have been. Right. So, as we start to get older, maybe you start to wonder, like, hey, what were they like at my age? What would we talk about now that I'm an adult? Like I said, maybe you're becoming a parent yourself and you find yourself yearning for your mom, wishing that she could be there. Maybe your dad died at 45 and now you're 46. And there's this like surreal feeling of outliving your parent. Like, how is that possible?
Mhm.
Maybe you find yourself grieving different aspects of them at different ages. I also find that there's this like longing maybe to ask questions that we didn't think or know to ask when they were alive, right? And then there's these like other complicated feelings that might be mixed in, like a guilt maybe for not remembering their voice as clearly anymore, anger that they're just missing out on everything. But all of these feelings are completely normal, completely valid.
Mhm. And I think that's a great example of how those like the stages of grief come back and like things can resurface again. And yeah, I think it's important for people to know that it's not just like this linear process.
Yeah, yeah. It definitely as much as it would be nice for it to just like follow a nice pattern because then it's predictable, we can kind of have some of that comfort there. No, it's definitely more like, okay, we go here from, anger to bargaining to, sadness to anger again. Like it goes all over the place throughout our lives.
Absolutely. And I remember something that Lauren had told me. She talked about how like grief comes and goes in waves. And so Like you might feel better one day and like that might come back again. So it's like either waves or it feels like a ping pong. It's it can be tricky to navigate.
Yeah, it can be. I think that speaks to like the unpredictable nature of grief. And I think, again, that makes us so uncomfortable. We'd like for it to be this like controllable thing. We'd like to put it in like compartmentalized, put it in like neat little boxes and file it away. But yeah, it ping pongs or it comes in those waves. I think that's such a good way of looking at it, that like the wave crashes and that's painful and then it'll eventually roll away, right? It like ebbs and flows like most things in life.
Absolutely. Makes me think of just like, how people begin to feel better and life goes on and they're able to, dive back into things that they were once doing. And then, a few weeks, months later, it's like, oh, why am I feeling this way again? And how complicated that feels. But like you said, we like things to feel controllable, but that's just not how this works. What do you say to clients in those kinds of situations where it's like they want things to be linear or like they're curious about when they're going to start feeling better.
Yeah. I kind of tell them that unfortunately we have to just ride this wave out, you know? I know it would be so much easier for us, like we can rationalize, okay, again, like there's this checklist, there's this timeline, like okay, we give us this like almost like false sense of comfort that like, yeah, in 6 months from now I'm going to be just fine, or once I get through that first year I'll be okay. So it's just kind of giving ourselves grace and compassion to feel like, and self-compassion to feel whatever it is that we're going to feel as it comes up, like as those waves are starting to crash on us. It's okay if I need to just, take a day and just be by myself and just sit with it. We feel uncomfortable. We don't want to be in pain. We don't want to be suffering. But kind of like getting comfortable being uncomfortable is kind of the only thing we can do as we're, again, navigating grieving.
Yeah. And like you said, though, I think this is another piece of like taking care of yourself, giving yourself grace. And then if you feel like you really need to take time to allow yourself that space to do that, even if it's just, a year or two down the line, like you still deserve that. It's not just like, oh, we're functioning on this timeline and you don't get that compassion anymore. It's like, no, you should always be giving yourself the self-compassion and the grace to move at a pace that feels authentic to you and you're not like forcing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you had said something earlier too about like comparing grief, right? Comparing how other people grieve versus our grieving experience. And yeah, I think that can be so detrimental. I tell clients not to do that, of course, because yeah, how I grieved, how your friend grieved, how your mom grieved might not be your experience, and that is okay, right? We don't want to pathologize it and just kind of let ourselves feel and experience whatever we need to.
I think I know mentioning social media again, but I just like really feel like that is a place where people go, of course, for community and like to find people who have had similar lived experiences and finding comfort in that. But I think that also can really disrupt some things as far as like, oh, well, he or she is like being able to do this thing and they seem to be feeling better and they're now traveling and doing all these things. And I'm still stuck in bed. I think that's where it gets really complicated with, okay, how do I find the balance between, yes, this is a really great space for community versus am I consuming too much and like putting myself in that comparison space?
Yeah. That's so hard to do to like consume social media or media in general, like mindfully and intentionally. I think we can all get kind of trapped in the like being sucked in to social media and being stuck in those mind traps. So it's really, yeah, really important to just remind ourselves not to compare ourselves to other people. And social media isn't, I find myself having a lot of conversations with clients, reminding them that social media is curated, right? It's not sure. Like you can see the highlight reels rather of somebody's life. You're not seeing the nitty gritty where, yeah, maybe they're having days where the grief has really hit them and maybe they're in bed and it's really debilitating and they're having a really hard time. Most people aren't posting that on social media. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but most people are only sharing, again, that like really curated highlight reel that they want other people to see because what social media is, right? So really hard not to get stuck in that comparison. But I think it's important to remind ourselves, again, we're only seeing what people are choosing to share with the world.
So true and so important for people to know, especially young people who are like navigating social media for maybe not like the first time. Social media has been around long enough, but just having these experiences and knowing when I love how you said using it mindfully, like knowing when it's time to turn it off or to take a break from the app or whatever that might be.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess as far as like the evolving nature of grief, now that we're kind of on that topic, what does it mean when we say that grief doesn't end, but it changes shape?
Yeah. I love the phrase grief grows with us. We don't outgrow grief, right? In the beginning, grief really feels all consuming, like it's taking up all of the oxygen in the room. Every song, every place, every moment is like saturated with their absence, right? But over time, it doesn't disappear, it integrates, kind of like we were talking about before. So the waves come less frequently, though they can still hit just as hard. But what really changes is our capacity and ability to hold it, right? Early on, hearing their favorite song might be unbearable. Like it starts to come on, we have to turn the radio off. Years later, maybe that same song, though, might bring a bittersweet smile. We miss them deeply, but we can also hold like the warmth of their memory alongside that like heartache that we're feeling. It's less about that pain disappearing and more about our life kind of expanding around it. We're not moving on from them. We're learning to move forward with them kind of woven into, who you've become.
I love that. And I think it reminds me too of being able to have traditions that might involve a loved one, and like whether that's around the holidays, like making their favorite recipe. I know that was an example that you had given. Um, or just like visiting their favorite place and like being able to like integrate them into like life right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of folks have different symbols or like rituals to kind of maintain that relationship with their loved one.
Absolutely. Um, and I think that's important to I think we should talk about that. So, I guess as far as like rituals, what are some common things that like you would do you typically like recommend things to clients, or do you like figure out like what that relationship was with their loved one and then help them create a ritual? Like what is that process usually like?
Yeah. So again, I think there is no right or wrong way to grieve, right? There's no right or wrong way to do any of this. It's just what feels the most right to them. And that might change from year to year, month to month, so to speak. So I think it's such an individual process and it's so subjective. But I've worked with clients who have saved seats for their loved one at like important events or have lit candles on their anniversaries or have gotten tattoos. I'm one of them. I've gotten tattoos to honor my loved ones. I think it's all about keeping the memory alive and in conversation, right? Like telling stories about them to your kids, or your partner, people who have never gotten to meet them, saying their name, laughing at jokes, at their jokes or retelling their jokes,
Mhm.
honoring their values by how you live. Like the relationship doesn't really end. It just evolves into one where memory and love are what's carrying them forward. So it's so, unique to the person. Some people maybe find comfort in signs, right? Butterflies, or like I said, their song coming on, dreams. And whether or not those are like real doesn't matter if they bring comfort. So it really is such a unique.
Yeah, it is not a one size fits all of like this is what you should be doing, or like here are some ideas. It's like what feels right to you. Ugh, I love that. And I think that is such an important part of the process. Okay. So, how can you typically tell the difference between grief that's evolving and grief that's become stuck or like unresolved?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When I think of evolving grief, it means that we're able to engage with life while still carrying that loss, right? It means maybe we have bad days, but we also have good ones where, those days where maybe we can't get out of bed or it just feels really heavy, those still come, but we're also able to get out, go to work, do those things, right? We can talk about our person, feel that sadness, and then re engage with the present. We're functioning, going to school or work, maintaining our relationships, taking care of ourselves. It's not that we're not feeling the grief, it's that we're allowing ourselves to feel it, sit with it, process it, let it kind of move through us, and then kind of go about our daily routines. But on the other hand, I think grief can really feel stuck when it's not allowing us to continue living, right? It's this like feeling of that unrelenting pain that we might have been feeling in those earlier months or those earlier days continues. That same pain persists. So it becomes like a complete avoidance, I think, of anything either related to, our parent or the one that we've lost, avoiding talking about it, feeling guilty, like maybe we should have died too, or that life no longer has any kind of meaning. I think there's a lot of longing and ruminating without really being able to move through those thoughts or being able to move through those feelings is what I would consider to be like stuck grief.
I think that's really important for people to know. Can you name some like other symptoms, like whether that might be like behavioral or like physical
Yeah.
symptoms?
So, I think grief and depression can go kind of hand in hand. If you're grieving, it doesn't inherently mean that you're depressed, but I think grieving can give way to depression, certainly. So when I think about, this like stuck grief and the physical symptoms, maybe we just like feel heavy. It's almost like we're having to like push through jello almost, right? We're like in this like slog where things just feel immensely heavy. Things feel maybe we're fatigued or we're just like chronically tired. Maybe we've really withdrawn from people. We're isolating, right? We're not taking care of ourselves. We're not going to work. Our ability to kind of function in the world just kind of falls by the wayside, and it just grief really just takes over everything.
Absolutely. And I'm curious too, like, especially because I know you work with like preteens, teens, and adults, like, how might a caregiver be able to identify some of these symptoms, like in a preteen or a teen? Like, what are some of the things they might be seeing or noticing?
Yeah, I think that isolation piece, not engaging with their friends as much, maybe having school refusal, having a hard time
Mm.
getting to school, having a hard time, maybe losing interest in some of their activities, right? So maybe you have a teenager who is a big soccer player, and all of a sudden maybe they played soccer with dad, right? And now it's like this avoidance. I can't even think about getting on the soccer field again, right? I think those behavioral changes are really big in the preteen, teen, kiddo kind of age range where, yeah, you might see that in some adults too, but the kids might be having these like experiences or these feelings and not even connected necessarily to the loss, not connected to the fact that, yeah, I have this, I'm grieving. There's this big loss that I've experienced.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too about like even the irritability or like, they're really not themselves anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Any kind of like appetite changes, any kind of sleep changes, maybe sleeping too little, sleeping too much, right? That again, chronic fatigue, that tiredness. Absolutely the irritability is a big one in in preteens, teens, of course. But yeah, I think knowing the signs to kind of look out for can be really helpful and hopefully getting your kids some support that they might need.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think too of even just like that like you had mentioned this before, but just the social isolation of like, not wanting to go and hang out with friends or just like shutting down completely. And like you said, the school refusal, which I think it's so wonderful now that like we have so many great school counselors that we connect with. And so being able to like lean on the school counselors for support if that's something that like a caregiver is experiencing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, in my work with clients and my work with school, and I work with the schools to try to get us all on that same page so that we can get that functioning level back up. Again, it's not something that we're getting over necessarily, but it's something that we're learning to integrate into our lives.
Absolutely. And school is such a huge part of a child's life. So making sure that everybody is all on the same page and how do we collaborate to best help this child?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about like the social piece too. And as a kid, if you've lost a parent, that's not an experience that everyone faces. So I think that also contributes to some of that isolation and withdrawal, right? Like, well, my peers don't really get me, right? They don't really understand what I'm going through. Maybe they've lost, they can understand grief sort of, but if they've lost a grandparent or if they've lost a pet, certainly that's not to minimize that pain. But I think there's a different experience with being a kid and not having, the family unit that you think that everybody else has.
And that, again, going back to that comparison piece, it's so hard for kids to not compare, to be like, oh, well, like our family doesn't look like so and so's family anymore.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think it's such an important thing to just be mindful of for those caregivers and be on the lookout and to know that there's like proper support out there. I guess as far as like moving into adulthood and like the work of meaning making, what tends to happen when grief resurfaces in adulthood, sometimes decades later? I know you mentioned like weddings, like bigger milestones. Is that where you typically see it resurfacing?
Sometimes I think it's really common, especially if we've lost a parent at a young age. Maybe you were too young to understand, or maybe we weren't developmentally like ready to process it. Or maybe a lot of times you go into survival mode, right? We're just trying to get through each day. So we learn to compartmentalize, I think, out of necessity. But ultimately, like I said, we can't outrun grief. At one point or another, it's going to finally catch up. And it might not show up in that way that we expect. So, yes, it might be overt in those milestones or those like next exciting new chapters of our lives, but it also might manifest in anger or irritability, anxiety, numbness, or even, like you said, those physical symptoms. Maybe we have increased fatigue or body aches, or we're shutting people out. So, I think it's very different for everyone. We might struggle with sleep or have intrusive thoughts. We might not even be able to connect it to like that old loss, especially if it's been, like you're saying, years or even decades later. Know that something doesn't feel right, something feels off. But our bodies and minds remember, even when we think we've like dealt with it or handled it, the grief was always there. But now maybe it's finally safe enough to feel it.
Mhm. For sure. And something that I tell clients is grief triggers grief, just like I say, trauma triggers trauma. So it's like, you experience another loss and, maybe that's the loss of a pet. And then it's like, it feels very similar to the loss of a parent, like just like another attachment figure. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be another person or even like the loss of a job and like those kinds of feelings that are associated with the previous loss. So knowing that like it's like the strings of grief and how they're attached.
Yes, I think things are more connected than we give ourselves or give it the credit for.
Yes. So, how can grief show up in relationships with partners, friends, or even our own children?
Yeah. I think that's a great question because grief doesn't happen in isolation, right? So it impacts every relationship in our lives. As adults, maybe with partners, it can create some distance, right? Maybe we're kind of emotionally shut down because we're protecting ourselves from more pain. And now maybe your partner feels locked out. Maybe we're so overwhelmed by grief that intimacy, whether that's physical or emotional, just feels impossible, right? I think I see a lot of times communication breaks down because we don't really have words for what we're feeling, or because maybe our partner doesn't really know how to support us. I think grief can also bring up conflict around things like, how do I spend the holidays? Do we talk about the deceased? How much space to give grief in our shared life? I think some partners can be incredible supports, and then others might struggle with that like long-term nature of grief and unintentionally say like hurtful things like, oh, this is still coming up for you like all this time later. And then I think with friends, there's this gap in understanding too, right? Maybe they said the right things early on when we were in that acute grief, but maybe they don't know how to show up for you years later. And I think that can feel really frustrating or isolating, like no one really gets us. And sometimes friends disappear because grief makes them feel uncomfortable, or they assume you're over it, so they stop checking in. I think
Mhm.
that loss of support can compound that original loss, like you're saying, like that grief kind of, compounds grief and makes us feel even more alone. And then when I think about parenting, I think grief can really impact our ability to be present, our capacity to kind of be engaged when we're carrying that heavy weight of sadness, exhaustion, numbness, anger, right? It's hard to have patience, engage playfully, or be like emotionally available to your kids. So maybe you find yourself more easily overwhelmed or triggered, or there's a complexity, I think, of maybe parenting without your own parent even there to guide you. I think that can bring up some feelings, that
Mhm.
longing for advice or reassurance or just somebody that like understands you. So I think it affects everything. There isn't one relationship, I don't think, that doesn't have some kind of ripple down or trickle down effect.
Of course, absolutely, because it is like it's so heavy and it takes up so much brain space that it is really hard to be present for other people. I think something that I hear often is just like there's that outreach early on after the loss of someone and then it's like that really fizzles after a month or two. And like then like you said nobody's there checking on you and like that feels super complicated to be like well do they not care about me anymore or like I think it can complicate relationships and friendships.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it puts pressure, I think, on the person who is grieving to be the one that's like reaching out for support too, right? When people stop kind of checking in. And even though that's so common, yeah. And we know in like in the grief field that like within that like 3 to 6 month range is usually when people really stop kind of checking in. Again, I think that just further kind of like you're saying complicates things because it kind of feeds into that narrative that this is something that we should be getting over. Like
Mm.
that pain, the grief and all of the intense feelings that we're feeling should just dissipate in that 6 month mark, and that's just not, unfortunately, that's not realistic.
No, it is not. And I think it like further makes people feel isolated in that experience again.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So what role can therapy play when someone revisits their grief years down the road?
Yeah, I think therapy can be incredibly helpful, even or maybe even especially years after the loss. So, David Kessler, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he is an expert. For those who aren't, he is an expert in grief work and in the field of grief. He has this beautiful metaphor that grief is like a forest, and a grief therapist is like a forest ranger who is helping you kind of navigate through it. You don't have to walk through it alone and you don't have to know the way, but we face things when we're ready. And for many people, ready comes years or even decades after that loss, right? I had talked a little earlier about that idea that we compartmentalize and we go into that survival mode. So, you know, I think years later, if it is resurfacing, a grief therapist can help you kind of make sense of what you're feeling, especially when it shows up in those unexpected ways that isn't just sadness, maybe like the anger or anxiety or those like relationship struggles. In my work, I try to create a safe space to allow my clients to finally say the things that they've never been able to say out loud, or like those complicated feelings, the guilt, the anger at your parent for dying, right? The grief over the relationship that you didn't get to have. I view therapy as a way to kind of hopefully help you untangle that delayed grief from whatever the present day stressors are, whether it was, like you said, whether it was a loss of a pet or some other kind of loss that triggered this, or if it just kind of showed up unexpectedly one day. I think crucially a therapist won't rush you. 'Cause again, there is no timeline, whether it's been 5 years or 25 years, the grief is valid and there is support out there to help you again navigate through that forest.
I love that metaphor. I have not heard that yet, but it makes so much sense. And to know too that like they have a support person like in their corner that's going to help them walk through this at their own pace. Like there is no timeline. We are not sprinting through the forest. Like we are going to navigate this on your terms. I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, I hadn't heard it until recently. And I was like, yeah, that is so true because it can feel like this dark, scary mess that we are trying to kind of go through often for the first time. And even if it isn't the first time, like every forest I think looks differently. So it's not my job to necessarily tell you how to go. It's just to walk it with you and kind of maybe help chop down some of the overgrowth that might be in the way.
Yeah, that you do not have to walk that alone. And I think it's especially important that like people have a therapist that understands grief. I think it is such a unique niche and it's not I think there are like general therapists who work with a variety of things, but like having that niche I think is so important.
Yeah, like I said, it feels meaningful for me in like this full circle way that, I experienced this loss. It was terrible, but yeah, I'm able to help others kind of navigate. And that feels like I'm making meaning or finding meaning all of these years later.
Absolutely. Okay. So, what helps people really integrate grief into their story without being defined by it?
Yeah. I think the first step really is recognizing that it's not a problem to solve, right? Or like this chapter to close. I look at grief as this like thread that runs through our entire life story. But the important piece is that it's not your whole story. Integration means acknowledging, hey, this loss happened to me without letting it become this loss is all I am. Right. So, and how do we do that? I think it starts with giving ourselves, again, grace and permission to feel multiple things at once. It's both and, not either or. We can miss our parent deeply and still like live a fulfilling life. We can take agency and decide how we want to tell, our story. I would encourage us not to be passive. You need to actively choose how grief fits into the bigger picture of who you are. Your loss is part of you, of course, but it's not all of you. Practically, this might look like creating those rituals to honor them without it totally consuming your life, building those support systems that acknowledge acknowledge our loss, acknowledge this terrible thing that we went through, but also see your wholeness, see who you are as a person outside of this loss. Engaging in therapy, maybe to help process any of the painful, hard stuff so that it doesn't fester. And maybe most importantly, like giving ourselves that permission to continue living. I think that's like the biggest thing that I can stress to others is that it is okay to continue on with your life.
And I think that's such an important piece too that you had mentioned of like not doing this passively. Like what does that typically look like for people if they're more taking that more like passive approach?
Yeah, I think like it, a passive maybe approach is like, yeah, we can like, acknowledge the grief, but we're not like doing anything about it. Like maybe there's that avoidance, like I said, we're not going to go to any of the places maybe that remind us of our parent. Right? So maybe they really liked this one restaurant in town and now I can't I can't at all order from there. I can't, go in and sit down there, right? We're passive in that we're okay, we're going to avoid and we're not going to allow ourselves to experience the pain. And I understand why we do that, but taking a more active role certainly is okay. I know that I've like avoided this restaurant for forever. And you know what? I'm going to place an order and I'm going to DoorDash that meatball sub that I know that, dad really liked or whatever it is. I think that's the difference.
Yes, it sounds like taking some of that, like, power back or, like, that's more in your control rather than just, like, allowing these like, you have to be avoidant and not going to those kinds of places. It sounds like something is kind of controlling that situation, whereas you can take baby steps. And like you said, DoorDash the meatball sub. You don't have to go into the restaurant. You don't have to drive anywhere. But I think that's wonderful and, like, being able to take things at their own pace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's very easy for us to take that very passive role because it's giving us this like false sense of comfort, but it's
Mhm.
that false sense of comfort, right? Like we're in what became our comfort zone. But I always ask clients, is that all that comfortable? Is our comfort zone all that comfortable or has it just become like normalized to us? So we have to push ourselves into a little bit more of like what we call the growth zone, right? The stretch zone so that we can, yeah, all right, I don't have to go physically into that restaurant, but what can I do? I can take back some of that control. I can take back some of the power and I'm going to, yeah, DoorDash or Grubhub or whatever it is. And I don't even need to talk to anybody. I can just do it on an app. It is baby steps.
Yes, yeah, and it makes me think, like, the more we avoid things, the bigger that, like, anxiety gets.
Mhm.
So but also making sure, like, you're ready and feel like you have the proper supports to move into that stuff.
Yes, that's the other piece certainly is like having a support system, whether that means your partner is there with you to make that scary step or, you have a friend on standby that if you start, feeling things that you can call and say like this was really hard for me. I think it's multiple things that are happening in that process.
Yes, yeah, the support's so necessary. So I think that's such a wonderful and important piece to healing. So I guess as far as just like guidance for listeners, for someone who lost a parent young and finds their grief resurfacing now, what is something that you would want them to know?
Yeah. First, I'd want them to know you're not broken, right? You're not going backwards. Completely normal. Grief doesn't follow a timeline, and it doesn't mean that you did something wrong if it resurfaces years or, like I said, even decades later. Grief doesn't expire. It's completely normal for it to resurface, especially around those new life stages as we continue living. You're not the same person you were when they died. So, of course, you're going to grieve them differently now. It's not something that we need to fix. It's not something to pathologize. It's just our heart reminding us that that love doesn't end. Honor it, feel it, know that needing support years later doesn't mean you're failing. It means that you're human.
Yeah, and you're continuing to like grow in life and like it's okay to need that support.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I guess as far as like what can friends, partners, or loved ones do that's actually supportive versus what we often default to saying?
Yeah. We had that conversation about support kind of dying off, right, in those like 3 to 6 months. So I really encourage checking in consistently, not just in that immediate aftermath. Check in on those anniversaries, the holidays, the birthdays, a simple text like, hey, I know this week might be really hard for you, but I'm thinking of you and your mom and sending you love, I think can mean everything, right? Grief, we talked about the idea that grief can feel so isolating and they might not have the energy to ask for support, or they might feel silly 5 years later. Why am I feeling this so intensely? So reaching out first, I think, lets them know that you're there. You're in their corner. They have your support. Knowing that grief has no timeline, it isn't linear. Even if they appear fine, like and then have a really hard day out of nowhere, don't assume that they're over it just because time has passed. Those milestones, like we've talked about, weddings, graduations, becoming a parent, I think can bring those fresh waves of grief and anticipate those times and offer some of that extra support without them having to ask. I can't express how nice that is to have to just know that you have that support without being the one that has to be like, hey, I'm having a really hard time. I think so many people avoid mentioning the deceased because they're afraid that talking about, their loved one is going to make their friends sad. Kids are your friends already like aware. Your friends already thinking about them, right? Again, because it's this ongoing process. So bringing them up, I think, also shows them that you haven't forgotten, right? You can say their parent's name, ask about them. Hey, what was your dad like? Or I'd love to hear a story about your mom. And it gives them permission, I think, to keep that person alive and in conversation As far as what not to do, I think using classic, like unhelpful phrases like, well, they're in a better place now, or everything happens for a reason, or you're so strong. Like, I think the intention is often good, but I
Mhm.
think those phrases really just tend to minimize the pain instead of like actually acknowledging it. So
Mhm.
instead, I would say, try, I'm so sorry. This is really hard. I'm here whenever you need me, or just tell me what you need right now. And be okay with whatever they tell you, even if it is just silence.
Absolutely. No, I think those are all such important things. And you had mentioned this at the beginning, like grief is something we all experience, but we really often don't know how to handle it when we're confronted with it or if a loved one is confronted with it. And so I think those, just like that last bit, is so helpful.
Yeah, it is. It's such a weird thing because it's something that all of us will experience at some point in our lives, maybe in different ways. But yeah, it's just like, I don't know if it's taboo to talk about or what it is. It's just not something that we are ever prepared enough for.
Absolutely. Um, okay. So if you could tell someone who's freshly grieving a parent one thing that's ahead, what would you want them to hear?
Yeah. It does get better. I want them to know that like what they're feeling right now, that overwhelming pain, the disbelief, the frustration, the exhaustion, it won't feel this intense forever. And it's not because the loss becomes less significant or doesn't matter anymore, but instead, again, we'll develop a different capacity to be able to hold it. Right now, it might feel like we're being swallowed whole. I promise you will find your way through this, even when you can't imagine how, right? Your pain is valid. You don't have to perform strength for everyone. I think it's okay to fall apart. And it's okay to need people to bear witness to your pain without trying to fix it. It's not something that you have to be good at or get through quickly. Again, give yourself permission to feel whatever you're feeling, the sadness, the anger, the good, the bad, even the moments when we forget and feel okay. It's all part of that process. And I think something that I wish someone told me is that you will laugh again. Like, you will experience joy without that guilt. You will have those good days. You will build a life that holds, both the grief and the joy. Your parents' absence is always going to matter, but it won't always hurt this much. You'll carry them with you in different ways and memories and how we live and the person that we become. But the relationship, it doesn't end. It changes. So be gentle with yourself, reach out for support when you need it, whether that's friends, family, or therapist. Let people show up for you and trust that even though it feels impossible right now, you have everything you need within you to navigate this journey, and you will survive, and you will find meaning and beauty in life again, even while carrying this loss and this pain.
And I'm sure that is so validating for people to hear. And even for those who are, um, you know, either experiencing this now or like this is something they've experienced in the past, like to know that that support is out there. And of course, we highly recommend Alex. But yeah, so I thank you so much for opening up this conversation. And like you said before, too, it feels taboo in some circumstances where it's like it's uncomfortable to talk about, but we have to learn how to sit in that discomfort. Um, and there are people that are available to walk through these phases of life that, like, know the proper support, so I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, there are forest rangers out there for you to help navigate. You don't have to do it alone.
Yes, oh my goodness. Well, I'm grateful that we have our own forest ranger here at Brave Minds.
Happy to be here.
Alright, so any other messages that you think would be important for our listeners to hear before we end for today?
Yeah, I think again, if I could stress anything enough, it's just give yourself that grace, show yourself some self compassion, do some self care, right? Beyond just throwing a face mask on, and it's really listening to yourself and whatever you need. Even years later, if you're having a really bad day, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that you're unhealed or that like you're stuck in your grief. It just means, all right, I'm having a really bad day. Maybe I need to just take care of myself. Maybe that means I need to just put on some comfy clothes and give myself some love and watch a feel good movie, right? Like I think it's just learning to be intuitive and mindful and listening to getting to know ourselves and what we need.
Absolutely. Yeah, and giving yourself grace and doing whatever you need to do. Yes. So again, thank you so much. I am very grateful that we were able to have this conversation today, and I know for a fact this will be helpful for people to hear. So thank you so much.
Thank you for giving me a place to talk about this stuff.
Of course. Of course.